Good morning. I'm Todd Brennan, a member of the UWM Alumni Association Board of Directors, and I'm a proud graduate of UWM's School of Freshwater Sciences. And I'm also a senior policy manager at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. And I'm really excited to take a moment out of everybody's morning to bring together some of these great minds that both represent some assets for UWM in southeastern Wisconsin, but also the region and the Great Lakes. And so in just a bit, we're going to introduce Susan Bentz and Dan Egan, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them. But I want to welcome you to our final mobile master chat of the year. And a thank you to close the 200 alumni and friends who are joining us today. It's my honor to introduce fellow UWM graduate Susan Bentz. Many of you likely know she is an award-winning environmental reporter at WUWM. But you may not know that she entered broadcasting in an untraditional way. After years of avid public radio listening, Susan returned to school and earned a bachelor's degree in journalism from UWM. She interned for WUWM News and worked with the Lake Effect team before being hired full-time as a news reporter and producer. I myself have known Susan for a while, and I really appreciate the work that she does and how she brings it to our attention, especially for the environmental integrity of southeastern Wisconsin and the Great Lakes on a regular basis. So I'm excited to hear more from Susan and Dan a little bit. Now, with that, Susan's going to be moderating our discussion with Dan Egan. And Dan Egan, if you don't know, is the Brico Fund journalist in residence at the Center for Water Policy in the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Freshwater Sciences. So Dan is an environmental journalist and author of Death and the Life of the Great Lakes, which if you haven't read that book, you should. Put it on your coffee table and get ready to read it, because it's probably the most comprehensive coverage of the Great Lakes that you can find at the present time. Egan was a reporter with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, covering the Great Lakes from 2002 until 2021. He has twice been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and he has won a slew of other awards that you should be aware of. But I'm not going to read them all, because that's how awarded he is. He has a lot of awards behind his name. He is a graduate of the University of Michigan and the Columbia School of Journalism. But he's also a native of Green Bay, Wisconsin. And he and I have talked before about work that I do up in Green Bay on the water quality issues of an area that's been plagued by these issues for a long time, and you'll hear more about it. He grew up to love Lake Michigan by spending summer weekends and vacations on the Door Peninsula, where both sets of his grandparents had summer homes. After graduating from the University of Michigan with a degree in history, Dan moved out west and worked as an assistant park historian at the Yellowstone National Park. In 1992, he began his newspaper career at the Idaho Mountain Express in Sun Valley, Idaho. From there, he moved on to newspapers in Idaho Falls, Idaho, Salt Lake City, Utah. During his decade out west, Dan covered a range of environmental issues, including efforts to restore threatened and endangered species like wolves, salmon, grizzly bears. He also covered the alpine skiing for Salt Lake Tribune during the 2002 Winter Games. And Dan moved back to Wisconsin in 2002, and where he lives with his wife and 4 children in the Milwaukee suburb of Whitefish Bay. So this will be a conversational style chat, but we will reserve time at the end for audience questions. So please type those in the chat as we go. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Susan Bentz, who's going to moderate the discussion with Dan Egan. Susan, take it away.
There we go. I lost my unmute. Thank you so much, Todd. Great to see you, even if we're not together. And I'm delighted to be able to talk to Dan again. We've spoken over the years a few times, and it's always a lot of fun and very informative, obviously. Dan, I wasn't going to start with this, but what brought you back from Idaho and other exotic places? Not that Milwaukee isn't exotic, but back here.
Oh, that's a good question. I have to remember. I had been at the Salt Lake Tribune from 1996 to 2002, and I had covered the Olympics in 2002. and I needed a break. And so my newspaper, the Salt Lake Tribune, gave me 8 months off, and I was going to go down to Mexico with my wife and then 1-year-old daughter to study Spanish. And we did that. We went down to a place outside of Mexico City, Cuernavaca, and we were there for about 6 or 8 weeks, and it was great. This was in the spring before the summer break, and then the American college students all came crashing in, and we decided we needed a break from that place. So we came back to Wisconsin for a little vacation with the intent on going back. And I stumbled into the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and sat down and talked to editor George Stanley, who back then was managing editor. And it turned out that his mom and my mom were friends from Green Bay, and he ended up offering me a job. So I had to cut short this sabbatical, as it was, and moved to Milwaukee in summer of 2002. So, yeah.
And then the Great Lakes beat came up immediately, or that was a sort of transitional thing?
Yeah, it was just kind of a evolution. I was hired to be a general assignment. I think they called it super general assignment. So that meant like longer features, like maybe one a week or something. And I kind of had carte blanche to just go out and find stories. And, I just kept finding stories that had something to do with the lake, whether it was zebra mussels or the history of the salmon stocking program, just cultural stories, life on islands. And after about a year, George and I went to lunch, and we're just talking about how the first year went. And at that point, this was 2003, and the paper was really robust in terms of staff, but things were you could see it was going to be getting tighter, and I think everybody was going to need a beat. And he suggested that my beat be the Great Lakes. So it's not a beat in a traditional sense, but it was basically marching orders to just focus on the lake, not just in the context of what it means for Milwaukee or our readership in southeastern Wisconsin, but for the region in general. And that was that was an interesting charge, because it really opened up my eyes and sent me traveling around the region. So yeah, that's how the beat came to be.
Very cool. So I want to make sure that, there's so many people listening in, and we're eager to have your questions submitted. So please do that. We'll get to questions as soon as we can, because, there's a lot to talk about. But before we jump into the Great Lakes directly, you're journalist in residence at the Center of Water Policy. What does that mean, Dan?
Well, right now, what it means is I need to be writing a book. And I need to finish that book. So I've been affiliated in some capacity with the university and the School of Freshwater Sciences, specifically since I think it was probably 2014 or 2015 when I took leave to write the Great Lakes book, and I needed an office. And I talked to the former dean, Val Klump, and he said that they'd be happy to welcome me with an office and library privileges, which at the time I didn't know how significant that was, because the library system, but the library on the main campus is just a powerhouse. It's just amazing, the resources at that place. So that kind of launched the relationship, and then it evolved over the following few years to just a position where I was originally doing long-term projects for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and we would credit the School of Freshwater Science for giving us the support, and so they were essentially paying my salary on kind of an annual basis, and it would flow through the newspaper. And then last year I left the newspaper and went straight. My relationship is directly with the university, and I'm here, like I said, to write this book. But that won't last forever. And then I'm here to continue to do long form journalism, but also to be a resource for the university and to represent the university when I'm out and about talking about these issues that I write about, because there's a lot of people here at the school who are involved in the kind of topics that I cover. And it's good for the university for people to know the work that's going on here. And I try to promote that.
Perfect. So the New York Times article, fairly recent, would be an example of that?
Which one?
I'm thinking of Chicago. I know.
I've only written one article for the New York Times in my life, and that was it.
Well, just the beginning.
The question about that, I'm sorry.
Well, did that, you were approached by the New York Times?
Yeah.
Or, so that wasn't, it benefits again?
Yeah, what
So
happened was,
you're part of the family here. Yeah.
yeah, the New York Times is a big operation. They have a climate desk, which would be a climate department in other environments, and it's huge. I think they must have they have their own photo editors, so they must have their own photographers. But there's probably 15 or 20 people, and the editor of that climate desk had, as I remember it, she had read the Great Lakes book, and there's a chapter in there that specifically deals with climate change. And she reached out to me last July 2020 and asked if I'd be interested in doing, actually it was a series of stories for the newspaper. And at the time I was still working for the Journal Sentinel, so the answer was no, but I started thinking about where I'm going and just kind of where I fit now journalistically, and decided it was probably time to break ties with the newspaper, since I hadn't been in the newsroom on a regular basis doing regular stories for several years at that point. So I departed from the Journal Sentinel, which opened the door for me to do a story or stories for the Great Lakes. And this particular story about Chicago and its unique vulnerabilities to climate change, it was born out of an interview I had done with, I think it was Chicago Magazine. I remember it was on my bicycle when I did it, so it was a pretty free-flowing affair. But the author asked me, what I thought about Chicago and its unique vulnerabilities to climate change. And it just kind of came out just off the top of my head. And so I sent that to the New York Times editor as a story idea. And she said, bingo, let's do that. So that sent me off on a path. I mean, that thing took like eight or 9 months because it's a big production. When they do these multimedia things, I've said before that it's the difference between like standing alone on stage or being in a play. And I definitely was an actor in a much larger play with that story.
So let's finally get to the book of the moment. I mean, that's been with us for a bit, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. So you didn't go out thinking, I am going to write a Great Lakes.
No, not at all. It had been suggested because, so I started this Great Lakes beat in 2003, and the way it evolved really quickly was that I would do one really big story a year, along with daily coverage as it popped up. And so after about 5 or 6 years, George Stanley, the editor, or maybe he was the editor by then, he had mentioned to me a couple times about writing a book. And I don't know why he was suggesting that, because that would mean I couldn't work at the paper as regularly as I had, but also I was, I have, well, now my oldest child is 20, but at the time she was probably 12, and then I have 3 others younger than her, and so I was very busy with home life and with newspaper life, and I just wasn't interested in it. And then, should I keep going?
Yeah.
So that changed in 10 years ago, in 2011, when my family and I went out to New York City for the academic year, and I had a fellowship at Columbia University in focusing, it was in the journalism school. It was actually a master's program, but it was focusing on science and environmental journalism. And along the way, I had to take a class, didn't have to, I was given the opportunity to take a book writing seminar. And so I had to have an idea for a book, and the only idea I had is what I had been doing at the paper for the previous 9 years or so. So I suggested and submitted that as a proposal, and it was really interesting to do this in New York City, because not only was I well beyond the Great Lakes Basin, I was talking to people who knew nothing about the Great Lakes. It was probably half international, and so I would tell these stories about the invasion of the lamprey and the idea that we would stock the lakes with Pacific salmon to eat an Atlantic invader alewives. People, you just see them going like this, and it was eye-opening to me, because you get too close to your subject over a number of years, and you stop realizing, that it's an interesting story. So from that seminar came the book, basically.
So I've heard that it was like a year of tweaking your proposal, and then once it was approved,
Okay.
It was 20 months to write. I mean, I know, but that's huge. That's a lot of work, Dan.
Yeah.
Well, good job. Excellent job. I mean, really. So let's go into what was your initial idea for the book's title, and what was the significance of that?
Okay,
What led
yeah.
to that?
I got an agent out of that class, and he happened to be a Milwaukee native, Barney Carpfinger, and I'm writing about Asian carp, so it felt like the stars were kind of aligning. But Barney has been in New York since the 1970s, and both he and the agent at W.W. Norton really tried to impress upon me that I was no longer writing for a southeastern Wisconsin audience, that this was a national audience and it needed to be treated as the subject matter, the Great Lakes, needed to be treated as a great national resource. And so my the book originally, as I conceived it and actually executed it as in the form of an initial draft, opened up with guy Dan Anderson and his dad Alvin, and Dan was the last commercial fisherman operating out of Milwaukee, and Alvin was the next to last generation of the family. They'd been doing it for I think 4 generations, and Dan up and moved to Alaska I think in 2010 because at first they were fishing for perch, and then it was whitefish, and then it was chubs. And by the end, he couldn't make enough. It was only chubs, and he couldn't catch enough chubs to pay for his gas. And I remember this, he could catch more salmon in terms of pounds in one day up in Alaska than he could catch in chubs all year long. So I had done a pretty long feature on the family and on Dan specifically. And so I opened up the book with Dan and Alvin being out on the water just weeks before he left for Alaska. It was a very emotional time for the family because they didn't want to see Alvin and his wife didn't want to see their grandchildren disappear up into the wilds of Alaska. But I was in a room with them while he was talking about the move with his mom, and he was just explaining to her that, look, Mom, there's nothing left out here. It's a liquid desert. So Liquid Desert was the initial title of the book. And I think it didn't really make it all the way through because, as I just mentioned, they were really trying to impress upon me that this was, they being the editor and the agent, that this was a national story and needed to be treated as such. And I was starting too locally. I still don't necessarily agree with that because I was going to end too, because Dan, I don't know if he still does, but at the time that I was writing the book, he would come back every summer and they would lease a commercial boat, he and Alvin, and they would go out fishing. And I was going to end the book with being out with them on one of these trips. But I wrote that chapter, and the editor he's a great editor. He's the editor for this book that I'm working on now. He wasn't delicate about it. He just said, no, that's not the first chapter. I'm like, what chapter is it? He said, we're not going to use it. Like, okay, there goes 2.5 months worth of work. But so it was going to be Liquid Desert, Death and Life of the Great Lakes. And then it just became Death and Life of the Great Lakes. And I think that works. I mean, that's half the thing that working with people in New York, the advantage to working with people in New York is that they are seeing things from a national perspective and more specifically a marketing perspective. And they thought that Liquid Desert was just too vague. So that's where the title came from.
So something I heard you say, I can't remember if it's in the book or something that you said in an interview, was that fisherman, that family said that the lake didn't leave. He wasn't leaving the lake left him. That's just so powerful.
Yeah, that came from this conversation. It was really interesting. So their last fishing trip before he moved permanently to Alaska, it wasn't out of Milwaukee. There was really no fish, to make a trip worthwhile. It was off the Door Peninsula, out of Gills Rock, right up at the tip near Washington Island. And they were staying, the Anderson family was staying in a guest house on the farm where Alvin, Dan, the last fisherman's dad, was born. I mean, he was literally born on the farm, on the kitchen floor. And so it was really neat that they were staying at the old homestead, as it were, while he was preparing to leave. And that's when I was in the room with them. And I got to say, I went out, and if a commercial fisherman ever asks you to go out with him or her, you don't have to say yes right away. You might want to think about it, because these guys I've been out with a number of fishermen in a number of contexts, and it's always way more exhausting and frightening than I expected it to be. And on this particular day, I remember we were in they call it Death Store in the waters between, well, we were a little west of the waters between Gills Rock, Northport, and Washington Island. It's very, very rough waters in bad weather. And I thought these guys were cool as cucumbers. And I thought a number of times the boat was just going down because the bow was just plowing into the water. And I remember Dan looking over at me and just seeing me ashen. And he said, "You want to be out here when it's rocking and rolling like this?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because otherwise you're on the bottom." And I was like, whoa. So it was an exhausting day, and we were having cups of tea at the end of it in this guest home. And that's where, Dan's mom was sobbing and saying that I think she referred to her grandchildren as her little bears or something like that.
Oh my gosh.
And, he was just kind of frustrated. And that's when he said, just kind of blurted, he's like, "Mom, I'm not leaving this lake. The lake left me." And as a journalist, you're like, okay, there's a quote.
There's a gem.
I think it was a headline of the story. So.
So Dan, you mentioned sea lamprey that, Great Lakes has been buffeted with invasives. Talk about that for people who haven't kept up on the hundreds of invaders.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was the interesting thing when I came back from being out west. I had a vague idea that salmon at some point, were planted in the lakes. And I think I thought that it was like a one-time deal, and they just, colonized the lake and had been self-sufficient ever since. And it was only after I decided to do a story on the history of the salmon stocking program that I began to realize how manipulated the lakes have been. And, I can't keep up with the numbers, but there's like some 189, maybe 191 non-native species in the lake now. And that doesn't mean that they're all bad. And bad is really, through the eye of the beholder, but the most impactful have been, the biggest one was lampreys for a long time. And those are eel-like fish that swam up the canals that we punched out to the Atlantic Ocean so we could open the Midwest to commerce. Prior to that, the lakes were really biologically isolated. So we opened the door, and in came swimming these eel-like lamprey, and they had no predators here. And so they just went to town on the native lake trout and whitefish and other ciscos, closely related fish, and basically knocked out the top of the food chain. And that was so devastating because it opened the door for another invader that swam up the same canal system, the alewives, which are like a anadromous herring. I mean, they have a combination of living in saltwater and freshwater. They spend their adult lives out in the ocean and they come back to spawn, but they don't need a saltwater component of their life if they have ample habitat. And the Great Lakes were ample habitat because there were no predators. So we ended up by the 1960s with a lake that was once, just filled with a variety of great commercially valuable and, environmentally valuable fish. They were gone, and it just became kind of an alewife operation or pond. And I think a lot of people who are of a certain age would remember the beaches littered with these alewives. And that was really an effect from the invasion of the lampreys. So yeah, it was like a forest fire hit the lakes, and we can't see the burning stands or the charred landscape, but it's underneath the surface.
So let's zoom ahead to zebra mussel and round gobies.
Yeah, so these first two invaders, one could say, came in honestly in that they swam in, they weren't brought in, but and they came up the canal system, the primarily the Erie and Welland canals, which bypassed Niagara Falls. But in the 1950s, this canal system was vastly expanded with the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is really just turning the wild St. Lawrence River into a navigation corridor, basically taming the rapids and widening it in places where it was too shallow and deepening it. So you could bring in, these 800-foot long ocean going freighters. And that happened the Seaway opened in 1959, and in came dozens of invasive species because these boats brought in ballast water, which they used to keep themselves steady on the open sea. but that water isn't dead weight. It contains anything that's lurking in a port anywhere on the globe where the boats are coming from. So they brought in zebra mussels. The first zebra mussel was discovered in Lake Erie, I think in 1986. And they were all over the lakes, except for Lake Superior, because it has different water chemistry and it's just a different lake. But they were all over the lower four lakes by the early 1990s. And then close behind them were quagga mussels, which are basically, they're very closely related to zebra mussels. They're just a little bit bigger and they're a little bit more damaging. And when I say damaging, I mean, they're not just these little thumbnail sized clams that are minding their own business. Well, they are basically, but there's trillions, if not quadrillions of them. And I was just talking to somebody yesterday about, like, I don't even know what a quadrillion is. It must be 40 zeros or something. I don't know.
I'll look that up.
It wouldn't be that, but it's a lot. It's a lot. And, as some of the researchers here at the School of Freshwater Sciences have told me, if we were to drain Lake Michigan, once you get beyond the beach where the mussels really can't get a foothold in the sand and in the surf, but once you get out a quarter mile or so, it's a carpet of zebra mussels, and quagga mussels, mostly quagga mussels now, from Milwaukee to Muskegon. And so each one of those can filter up to 1 liter of water a day, and they're filtering the plankton out of the water, which is the foundation of the food chain. So they've really, sucked a lot of the energy out of the lakes. And that may be more analogous to a forest fire than to the lampreys. I don't know what the lamprey analogy would be, but the invasive mussels really did just scorch life as we knew it in the lakes. And so,
yeah. So what about the fisheries? What's the state of the Great Lakes fisheries? Or maybe you want to zero in on a lake or two?
Yeah, so I'm not following this blow by blow these days, but generally speaking, what's happened in some ways is, it's a tragedy, and in other ways it's interesting, and in some way, and even other ways, it's kind of encouraging. And the encouraging component of it is, these invaders just keep coming, and behind the zebra mussels came round gobies, and they came from the same place, the Ponto-Caspian, the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea basins. And that's where the mussels came from. And then we brought in, via ballast water from these ocean-going freighters, round gobies, which are little thumb-sized fish that have these big teeth, and they're built to crack mussels open and suck out all the protein that the mussels have trapped in those shells. So we have gobies galore out in the lake, which is, not optimal. But what the gobies have done is they've opened up the door for this energy to flow back up into the food chain, because native species like walleye and whitefish and lake trout have figured out how to make a living off the gobies, which means they're figuring out how to make a living off the zebra mussels. So on Lake Huron mostly, but on Lake Michigan as well, it's the top of the food chain is kind of coming back together. Nothing like it was back, in the 19th century or early 1900s, but it still resembles more its natural self. Somebody could argue, I could argue, than it has since the 1960s. And so I guess it's a positive story in that respect. But that door to new invasions, it's been closed pretty closely, but something's either closed or not, and it's not closed. There's still a gap for these things to come through. But the governments of Canada and US have gotten a lot better about requiring the shipping industry to better manage their ballast water and to do everything that they can, or to do a lot to keep the next invader from coming.
So Dan, people are so mesmerized by your words, they're not asking questions. Are you surprised? Usually I see, like, I think they're holding back so that we're not inhibited with our time, but please do ask your questions out there. So you've talked, there's a front and a back door to this, to the Great Lakes. Talk about that. And they're, well, I don't know if we can say they're wide open, but.
The front door and the back door it's a good analogy. And I think George Stanley at the Journal Sentinel is the one who just kind of crystallized that for me. So the front door is the St. Lawrence Seaway, because that opened up the Great Lakes to everything on the Atlantic seaboard. And then the back door is the Chicago River, or the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, which is the modern version of the Chicago River, which is the river that has been reversed so it flows out of Lake Michigan instead of into it. And Chicago did this in the late 1800s and completed it in 1900. So what that did was basically provided a nautical link between Lake Michigan and the Mississippi River Basin. And so that meant we could move barges from New Orleans all the way to Chicago and points beyond. But that door also was opened to all manner of organisms that we may or may not want in the lakes. And, you know, the number one villain right now are the Asian carp that are, you know, swarming and teeming in the Mississippi River Basin, but they're not yet in the lakes. If they do make it into the lakes, it's likely going to be through this back door, the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. And so a lot of this book, the Great Lakes book, was organized on how do we close these doors to these unwanted species, but still keep them open to commerce, which we need and is definitely a good thing. And there are ways to do it with technology. And, you know, we are working on a more robust, right now, the only thing standing between the Great Lakes or the Asian carp and the Great Lakes is an electric barrier system on the canal, which is just this kind of crazy contraption that electrifies the water and is supposed to stun the fish. Yet we keep finding evidence of the fish above the barrier. They haven't found any evidence of spawning carp above the barrier, but they have found carp DNA. And because water is flowing away, flowing downstream, the DNA isn't going to float upstream. So a carp's made it past dead or alive. Now, it could have been through the belly of a bird. It could be somebody could have planted it, but yeah, that is the pathway. And the Army Corps is now working on a more sophisticated and robust barrier. There had been proposals to just re-reverse the Chicago River to make it flow the way nature designed it to, which is doable and is the kind of ultimate solution, if you will, to dealing with invasive species moving between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Basin, which spans like 40% of the United States. But there wasn't federal buy-in for it. It was, you know, it's a big, expensive project, and it would require dramatic upgrades in the way Chicago treats its wastewater, because instead of sending it down the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico, its treated wastewater would be going into Lake Michigan, which means they'd have to do a lot specifically to pull nutrients out, because Lake Michigan doesn't need any more nutrients. So that's the back door, and the front door is the seaway. And we can do a better job in the seaway by, and they are starting to phase in water treatment, mini water treatment plants on the boats that sail into the lakes from around the globe.
So if those doors, we'll call them that, were to be closed, and is there a chance that the lakes could rebound, you know, to a more natural, you know, natural state, or is there a natural state left to be had?
Well, it could maybe a steady state is a better way to put it. I mean, we're never going to bring back the species that are gone, but we can have a more balanced system. And I think we're seeing that because, you know, they as we're phasing in, as the industry is phasing in these treatment systems on the ships, they're also requiring them to flush the ballast water tanks with salt water in the mid-ocean. The idea being that you will flush the tank of anything lurking in it, flush the tanks. And these are, you know, call them tanks is a misnomer. They're just huge chambers. But if you send a pulse of salt water in there, you flush out whatever fresh water was in, organisms might have been in there. Or if you don't, the idea is that the salinity from the mid-ocean flush will kill them. And that it kills most of them. But if you've got millions of critters and you only kill 99.9%, you've still got thousands. So it's not a perfect solution, but it's a good one for now. And I do think going forward, you know, and this is one of the things that not just in the book, but in my journalism I do in general, is to try not to point too firm of a finger at previous generations, because they were making the best decisions that they could at the time. But we've learned a lot now. And now that we have that knowledge, we have a responsibility to put it to practical use. And that is to shut these doors to the extent that we can.
So someone in the audience did ask, this is a shift, but do you communicate with colleagues who cover other large freshwater systems worldwide, such as, well, I'm not reading the rest, but, you know, other large lake systems?
No, I got my hands full with these lakes. And I do communicate with other people in the region who cover lakes. And I have, I mean, I went down to Tasmania, I think it was in 2010, right during the heat of the Asian carp invasion. And when we were trying to figure out what do we have on our hands here and what tools do we have to stop them. And I was really interested in seeing how other countries deal with similar problems, even if they're not on the same scale. And in Tasmania, it was really interesting because there were two lakes. And so it's an island off of, well, it's part of Australia, but I don't know how many hundreds of miles. It's out there by itself. And so the island cultures have a heightened sensitivity to invasive species for obvious reasons, because they can see the impacts dramatically. And so they found two lakes that had common carp in them, and they were connected lakes, and somebody had planted them there for whatever reason. And they basically went in, and these were vacation lakes like you would see in Wisconsin's North Woods, and they just shut them down. Like there were vacation homes up on these lakes, and people couldn't go to them anymore. And they went chasing after every single carp that they could get. And I don't know what the status is, but they were down to like a handful of them, but it only takes two, when you're in the right conditions, only takes one to, relight that fire. So there's an example of talking to people about, other freshwater lake issues in other places. But the lakes themselves, there's so many issues, and they're so vast geographically and culturally too, that they've pretty much kept me busy for that stage of my career.
Yeah. So this is just a twist on that question, Dan, and I think it's worth asking. I don't know if it's the same person or a different one. Do you communicate again outside the Great Lakes to the oceans and salty coast communities? How do you get the Great Lakes to resonate with them? This person feels as though the Great Lakes often get overlooked.
Yeah, well, when this book came out in 2017, I think it was with Harvey Bootsma. I think it was Harvey, and it might have been Val Klump, but we were on Science Friday with the Science Friday guy. And
NPR.
Yeah, and it's a national show, and apparently one of the people listening was in California, and this is relevant. He like 2 months later got a job at Comedy Central with the Daily Show, and he's a Michigan native, and he reached out to me and wanted to do a piece on why the Great Lakes don't get oceanic respect. And his idea was to, somehow in the public's mind, convince the public to adopt the lakes as, a fifth seacoast or fourth seacoast, however you want to call it, coasts. So we did it, and it was goofy and zany, and the guy pulled it off just because of his sheer force of personality. At one point, he had two cans of Morton salt, and we were on a boat off of Chicago, and he didn't tell me he was going to do this. He was going to pour the magic salt into the lake so they'd get respect, and he did this. And I was like trying to get out of the frame. I'm like, I don't want any part of this, and I don't think that made it into the final cut. But it is a good question, why the lakes don't get the same kind of respect that the oceans do. I mean, sure, they're not as deep and as vast as the oceans, but they are huge, and more importantly, they're freshwater, and there's 10,000 miles of coastline between the US and Canada of Great Lakes. That's more than the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast combined. And there's 40 million people who live inside the basin lines. And as I just mentioned, they're freshwater. I mean, that's sustenance. So when you look at the grade school globe and you see these blue blobs in the middle of the North American continent, that color should be something, I don't know, either the ocean should be a different color on the globe or the lake should be a different color, but they're not the same thing. I mean, maybe the lake should be gold, but I don't want to commodify them in that respect too much. But they do, I think, not get the attention that they deserve, but I do think that they soon will, given the way we are going with water resources, not just continentally, but globally, and agriculture, everything. I mean, you look at what's going on in the Southwest, and that's not sustainable. And I hope, and I'm pretty confident that we won't in our lives see Great Lakes pumped to drier regions, but maybe people will come to the lakes and we can, bring people to the water instead of the water to the people, and then set them up so they can have a sustainable future.
So the Great Lakes Compact is going to be tested, increasingly tested.
Yeah, I think so. 10 years ago, I think it was adopted in 2008, and it basically prohibits large scale diversions out of the region by requiring anybody, and it's super technical. It was really written to get Waukesha water, because if we couldn't get Waukesha water, Wisconsin was never going to agree to this, and it had to be an agreement between the 8 Great Lakes states. And then there's a parallel agreement with the 2 Canadian provinces. But it was kind of a prescription to get communities that really consider themselves Great Lakes communities access to safe drinking water, but prevent communities beyond. So what it does is there's a basin dividing line, and it's a watershed, and basically all the rain that falls and snow that lands inside that watershed flows downhill into the lakes. And if you start taking water outside that line, you start taking water from the lake system. Milwaukee, for example, takes plenty of water, but they treat it and they send it back, as does every other Great Lakes city. So the compact was designed to let cities basically who are close enough to the lake in a county that is touching the lake, it's written to allow them to basically engineer their way into the lakes, where they can take water, but they got to treat it and then send it back into that basin. And so 10 years ago, I would have thought this is stout enough. And the idea that we would spend the money and burn the fuels that it would require to pump a river's worth of water out west is folly. Then I did some further reporting for the Journal Sentinel on the amount of oil that's coming into the lakes from Western provinces and states in North America. And it's a river's worth. We're pumping, and that is not, liquid like water. It is thick, gooey stuff. And if we can, have the wherewithal to bring that much oil. I did a calculation one time comparing the cubic feet per second of oil coming into Superior, and then it flows through Wisconsin down into the Chicagoland, or flows through the UP down into Michigan and into Sarnia for processing and turned into the gas that everybody uses. But looking at the volume of it, it was basically equivalent or in the range of the flow of the Milwaukee River at Esterbrook Park in Milwaukee County in late August, which is like the lowest flow of the year typically, I think. So we do move a river's worth of oil. So I think we do have the capacity. And those pipes, you can clean them out and run things both directions. So the pipes are there, and it's something that we do need to keep an eye on. But that's, it's not just water volume, especially when the lakes are high. And we can talk about that in a second if you want, but it's water quality. And so people get very emotional when you start talking about water volume, and they get very sleepy when you start talking about water quality, and they're equally important.
So we haven't, as you've sort of touched yet on climate change, but someone asked another issue, which is related, harmful algal blooms.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a coalition formed through the Great Lakes Collaborative with the attempt of trying to address that issue. And what is your view, Dan, of the impact of harmful algae bloom and what needs to be done to mitigate it?
Yeah, I was talking to a class down here at the School of Freshwater Sciences yesterday, and they asked what I thought the 3 big threats were to the lakes going forward. And I think, we've already talked about invasive species and touched on climate change a little bit. And this is related to it, but algal blooms and nutrient pollution is, I think, the 3rd big one. And I'm not ranking them in any particular order. And who am I? I'm just a journalist. There's people in this building who could speak more eloquently about this than I. But I do think these algal blooms are trouble, and they're only going to get worse until we get a handle on how much manure we're allowing farmers to apply on their fields inside this watershed that I was just describing, because as I mentioned, all the water goes downhill into the lakes, but that water carries whatever is, on the land. And in the Great Lakes, and in the Western Great Lakes in particular, there's too much nutrients, agriculture nutrients, in the form of manure or chemically applied fertilizer, for the water to stay healthy, for the water to handle it. And all you have to do is take a trip to Toledo in any given late summer, and you'll see that made manifest in these just horrendous swaths of, brilliant green. Well, it's not algae, it's like a photosynthesizing bacteria, cyanobacteria, but they can produce, toxins. And in 2014, 500,000 people or so in Toledo lost their drinking water supply for a few days because one of these blooms went right into the drinking water intake off of Lake Erie, or on Lake Erie off of Toledo. And that was a real dramatic experience for people. They'd never dealt with something like that before. And I remember the region's mayors got together at the Shedd Aquarium in Chicago, and Rahm Emanuel at the time said, this changes everything. This is an important moment. Well, it didn't really change anything. And we're still adding factory farming operations, or CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. We're still adding them in the basin, which means we're still adding manure to the land, which means we're still putting manure into the water, and we've got algal problems. And we also have warming waters due to climate change, and that is another factor that really boosts these blooms. So they're getting the food, and they're getting the sunlight. They've always had the sunlight, and they're getting the warmth that they needed. And increased rains, they're like the more intense the storm, especially if they happen in the spring, when manure and nutrients are on the field before they can be taken up by the crops, it goes into the lake and gets taken up by a totally different crop, and that's this cyanobacteria. So that's, and there, it's not just Lake Erie. We have them on Lower Green Bay, and they're actually now Lake Superior.
I was going to say that's a more recent concern.
Yeah. And Lake Erie, or Lake Superior, was always thought to be too cold and rough and wild for these blooms, which need warmth and calmness to really prosper. But yeah, that's a big issue going forward, I think. And that's one issue that we can do something about. Like climate change, we can take a big picture view, but there's a lot baked into what's going to happen already. And so this is a lever that we can pull. And that lever is, you don't want any farm to go out of business, but you also don't want to be able to, you don't want to go to the beach with your kids on a hot late July day and see these signs saying, warning, toxin, water is too dangerous to touch. So there's a better path forward, and that is better controlling what goes on farm fields, and when and how, and what goes into the lake as a result, or what doesn't go into the lake.
Another jump here, Dan. Someone wrote in that there was an invasive carp DNA recently found in Milwaukee's harbor. Is it safe to say a fish made it this far, or may it possibly be some residual that just floated up and through a fish gut?
Yeah, I spent a fair amount of time back in 2009 or so, 2010, reporting on this environmental DNA, and it's basically a technology that when you just sift DNA out of the water, so you can find evidence of a species presence by, you don't have to find a fish or even a tail. You can just find it in the water. It's like fingerprints, it's exactly what it is. It's genetic fingerprints. And so it's a very, very powerful tool, but its strength is its weakness, because it's so powerful and sensitive. It can pick up, traces so small that they could be from any origin that you could almost imagine. They could be, I think I mentioned earlier, through the belly of a bird in bird poop, or it could be muck on the hull of a fishing boat. And they found Asian carp DNA up in Sturgeon Bay several years ago, and I think the theory at the time was there was a fishing tournament up there, and it must have been just the muck on the hull, or it could have likely been that. And so it could be the same case in Milwaukee and on the Milwaukee River. I think it's a little more worrisome because we're a lot closer to, where the fish are thriving down here than up in Sturgeon Bay. And I would think that before they start surfacing in Sturgeon Bay, we'd have found them along the way. So yeah, that's worrisome, but we also don't know to what extent they'll thrive once they get into the lakes, the Asian carp. They've done, great. They're basically running the show in large stretches of the Mississippi River Basin. But the lakes are a different kind of body of water. And we were talking about zebra and quagga mussels earlier. They eat the same stuff that the Asian carp do. And so the plankton numbers on the lake aren't what they used to be. And that would be food for the carp. So in some sense, maybe the invasive mussels have already beat them to the punch, but we don't know. And you don't want to find out. And, we write mostly in the media about big-headed carp and silver carp, but there's two other species. There's grass carp, and they're already established in some areas of the lake, and they eat like seaweed, basically. Big-headed and silver carp are like little baleen whales. They filter plankton out of the water. They're all like, it's like cartoon characters with superpowers. The fourth species is black carp, and they eat mollusks. They eat mussels. So they're the biggest of the Asian carp. I'm just going to pull a number from memory, but I think they can get to be like 120 pounds. I mean, they're the size of a person. And I know, talking to some of the fish farmers down in Mississippi, I think it was Mississippi, several years ago, they were talking about how they wanted to bring black carp up to a convention, some kind of symposium going on. I think it was in Milwaukee, on how to deal with invasive mussels, and they were going to bring in some sterilized black carp and show them do these demonstrations in these big tanks. And the Wisconsin DNR said, no, don't even think about it, because you never really know if you've adequately sterilized something like that or not.
So Dan, the same person asked, do you think that our tributaries like the Milwaukee River or the Root River would be able to harbor a carp population?
I'm not an expert. I could call somebody up, and find out real quickly. But it wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, mm-hmm. they thrive, in a lot of places, and so yeah. And you really don't want to see this, because if you go to these infested stretches of, well, it's not just the Mississippi River, it's the Illinois River, it's the Missouri River, but I've been out on boats with these researchers. And everybody wears helmets, hockey helmets, face cages, because the silver carp jump and at the whir of a boat motor, and it's made like recreating in terms of jet skiing or water skiing. It's made it, if not impossible, it's turned it into an extreme or extremely dangerous sport. And so maybe the fish won't thrive out in the open waters of, say, Lake Michigan, but they may do really well in the bays and the rivers, and that just happens to be where everybody likes to boat and recreate. So I guess my short answer is you don't want to find out.
So I want to try to squeeze in two more questions, which we'll see if that works. One person wrote in that person finds marbles when he or she is looking for beach glass. And I've heard that person says that they are used for shipping purposes to weigh down barrels that were dumped into the lake when no longer needed. Do you know if that's true?
I don't, but I'm guessing that's taconite. That's the semi-processed ore that comes out of Minnesota, and I think the UP, but yeah, they're like musket balls. I remember growing up in Green Bay, we used to find them along the railroad tracks that ran along the Fox River, and we'd use them in our, they're called wrist rockets, our slingshots. They were perfect ammo for that. But that's probably what that is. And there's been a lot of taconite spilled in a lot of places all over the Great Lakes.
So finally, I think probably, what do you believe is the potential for Milwaukee and Wisconsin to capitalize on the science and economics being explored by the School of Freshwater Sciences and other related research and institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're at the forefront here of just, a new era of looking at the lakes not primarily as nautical highways, which is really how they were. And we thought it was an endless supply of commercial fishing. So we exploited the lakes quite a bit, and through this canal building and dredging, and really doing everything we can to make ships fit and to put food on tables. But the lakes, they're not inexhaustible, and we know that now. And they're not impervious to the insults and assaults that we visit upon the lakes. And so going forward, and we were talking earlier about, it's a freshwater trove, and people are going to be craving fresh water. I think an operation like the School of Freshwater Sciences, and there's similar research, not similar, but there's other research centers around the Great Lakes. There is a changing ethic, I think, where people are valuing the lakes just for their intrinsic value, but also seeing that we're strategically located. I have teenage kids now, and they talk about, kind of feels like we're in a sweet spot here, given where things appear to be headed climate-wise and precipitation-wise and agricultural-wise. So I think there's a changing ethic, and we're valuing the lakes, and we're also looking at how to manage them in a sustainable way so they'll be there for future generations. And I don't think we were doing that in the 1960s and 70s when I was a kid. We didn't really care, and I think we care more now. And we could care more still, but we're on the way.
So this may lead to the book that you're working on, Dan. People are asking about capturing manure and filtering out the phosphorus reuse so that there's less runoff and less harmful runoff. What's your read on the viability of that?
Well, I think, right now, and also manure is a great fertilizer, even if it isn't processed. It's got, it's the way nature works. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, you eat something, it defecates, it fertilizes the next generation, and on and on and on and on. And that's what manure does. And so it's not an inherently bad thing. The problem is we have too much of it. And, what you'll hear now is that it just costs too much. Let's set aside the idea of treating it. Let's just talk about moving it to places where it could be used instead of synthetic fertilizer, which is made from phosphate rocks and from nitrogen and potassium. Manure has all that, and there's land that needs all that, lands that need all that. The argument against it is that it's been too expensive. That once you start moving a truck, it's worth of manure more than, I don't know what the number is, like 10 miles or something, it's no longer economical. Well, it's not economical to trash Lake Erie to the point that you can't, drink it, let alone swim in it, or vice versa. So yeah, there's opportunities in solving this problem, economic opportunities, and they just need to be recognized, and they need to be. We've tried a lot of carrots, and I think now it's time for the regulation of some sticks to require it. And regulations aren't inherently bad as long as they're uniformly applied. It's going to cost farmers something, but then that's going to drive up the cost of cheese and milk for everybody. And so your milk becomes a little more expensive. You're paying for it, even if it's cheap, in the form of polluted water. So, we've got to have an honest kind of reconciling there. And I think in the end, there's nothing more valuable than safe, fresh water. Oh, can't hear you.
Yeah, I guess I just want to make sure, Maggie, if everyone can hear me, I'm live, but that does bring us to the end. Hopefully you can, but that does bring us to the end. And I can see we could have gone on and on and on once we started getting the conversation rolling and the questions. I obviously can have those conversations all day, and really appreciate everybody being able to tune in. I will say that story about Dan Anderson, I was on his boat, much like you, Dan, and rocked and rode the waves, and knew two friends that crewed on his boat. And that article that you wrote did not leave me with a dry set of eyes. One of the few times I've read a newspaper article and shed a tear over it. So I know you know this, Dan, but just in case you don't, you're not only communicating the science and the issues to this broader audience, but you're archiving pivotal socio-cultural junctures, in our natural history as it relates to the Great Lakes. And so I just want to say thank you for all that you've done, and for Susan for digging in and bringing that out with her expertise as well. So on behalf of the UW Milwaukee Alumni Association, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and you all for giving us your time. And this was the last in the series of the Master Chats, but stay tuned for more in the future. And with that, we'll go forth into our day, having hopefully seeded a discussion that we should all be having constantly about our relationship with the Great Lakes. So thanks again, Dan and Susan and UW Milwaukee for putting this on.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.